Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I think briefly before I start, I'll just explain my title, and then we'll, without much more further ado, we'll jump straight into it. Visions of Athens in 18th century travel writing. It was very hard to come up with an exact title for what I wanted to do. Particularly, I'm going to talk about visions, both in terms of looking at ruins, but visions on the historical page, not just of Athens, but also of the Athenian Empire. That is to say, a particularly maritime form of empire that I will argue British readers found echoed their own situation in the 18th century North Atlantic. And when I say 18th century travel writing, I don't just mean sort of dilettantes, Byron, sort of sitting there writing in their journals. I've taken a very expansive view of travel writing. I'm going to include historians who travelled around the North Atlantic, who went to the West Indies, went to the American colonies, as well as historians, scholars, architects, and archaeologists who travelled to Athens itself to muse upon the ruins of the Periclean building programme and the ruins of the Athenian Empire. To paraphrase football commentators from England, I will present a paper of three halves. The first half, I will look at the Athenian Empire itself in British political thought. I'm going to argue that the Athenian Empire was a maritime, commercial, and above all, free form of empire, which British thinkers thought was much more pertinent to their own situation over, say, the Roman Empire, the French Empire, that is to say, an absolutist, land-based power that expanded and was led by a monarch or a tyrant. In the second half, I'm going to look at the ways this discourse, this tradition of reading Athens was influenced, was changed, and was kind of prompted by an engagement with Britain's own empire. Throughout the 18th century, Britain went from provincial backwater to the preeminent power in the world. In the 19th century, of course, they ran everything. That was a process of maritime expansion, and as that happened, new sort of ways of viewing the Athenian Empire, new ways of viewing the Athenian Empire's significance began to emerge. And in particular, I'm going to point towards the decline and fall of Athens. What scared the hell out of these guys was the idea that British power was not permanent. And one of the ways they could sort of try and think about the future was to look at what happened to Athens. And they started to think in particular about what were the causes of the decline and fall of Athens and what were its sort of effects. And then they would sort of read that back into situations contemporary in Europe and contemporary in Britain. Finally, I want to look at travellers who went to Greece and to Athens in particular, and I want to look at their relationship to this political and historiographical engagement with the history of Athens. So I want to look at how they were sort of grounded in these political problems, but also how they then articulated new forms of decline and fall, new ideas of decline and fall prompted by an engagement with the ruins of Periclean Athens. I'm both going to look at the connections between travel to both the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, but also the differences. I'm going to draw comparisons and contrasts. So how do we know that the Athenian Empire was important for British thinkers? I want you to imagine, I want to conduct a thought experiment, that you are this man, Thomas Goldney III. Goldney was a merchant in Bristol, very rich man. He lived in this house here, which was built by his grandfather in the 1720s. And I want you to imagine you're Goldney and you live in that tower. It's August the 1st, 1753, and you wake up in the morning and you look out upon your gardens. Now, your father has built this kind of French-Roman house. But you've been on the grand tour. You've been to Italy. You haven't been to Greece, but you've been to Italy. And in Greece, you picked up Greek tastes, Grecian tastes. And you've built this. You've built the orangery, which is sort of directly opposite the tower. And you describe this orangery as particularly Greek. There's a picture of Sherlock Holmes having dinner in the magnificently appointed Grecian orangery. You've also filled your garden with what you call Greek statues. Now, you and I both know these statues are very Italian. That Hercules is quite clearly from Rome. But you know him as Hercules, so you call him a Greek statue. And you put these Greek statues in a very English-looking garden. You can see just in the foreground, Goldney also built a Gothic tower. Behind Hercules, it doesn't survive, but in the 18th century, there would have been a flower bed, a massive flower bed, kind of sort of like 200 meters across, in the shape of a Union Jack. So this guy has a Greek garden with very English sort of patriotic symbols in it. He's also spent a lot of time in this garden. This is his shell grotto. He got the shells from his own trading ships. There were at least 250,000 shells, and he glued all of them on himself. And in the middle of this Grecian, well, it's based on the one from the island of Capri, but again, he describes it as Greek in his will. He put a Greek statue. So you're Thomas Goldney. You've looked out over your tower at your Greek garden. You've put on your stockings and your breeches, and you get in your hansom cab. And you ride down for a day's work in the centre of Bristol, and you end up here, which is, again, a magnificent Greek sort of revivalist building. This is the heart of commerce at Bristol. This is one of the most richest buildings in what was then the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, today, and this says a lot about built heritage in England, it's now a Wetherspoons pub. But back then, it was, worth a lot of money. And you turn up at 9 in the morning, and the first thing you do is you get a consignment of metal, which comes down from your foundries in Shropshire. And they bring you down muskets, knives, pans. And you put these knives and pans and muskets on your ship, and your ship is dispatched to Sierra Leone, where these items are traded for slaves. The slaves go to the West Indies. The empty ship then goes up to Boston to take on hemp, which is then re-imported to Bristol, where you make a fortune selling tobacco, hemp and wine, God knows what else. You do that in the morning. In the afternoon, well, you own 6 trading ships, but you're very worried about the safety of these trading ships. So with a couple of your mates, you invest in a privateer. You're going to conduct your own private war against the French. You're going to protect your trading ships, and hopefully you're going to take their trading ships, bring them back to Bristol and sell their cargo as your own. And we know Goldney did this because the insurance company he set up to protect his investment, his privateer was obviously a warship, it might have been sunk, eventually became the NatWest RBS Bank we have today. So this is a guy with serious money. And what I want you to take away from this vignette of his life is how commercial and how maritime it is. Everything connected to his wealth looks towards the sea, and it looks towards the triangular trade of the Atlantic. And not only that, he's extending the empire through his commercial interests, but he's also extending the empire very practically through warfare. This is a guy utterly sort of enmeshed in the imperial system. And this is true of Britons who live in Liverpool, Plymouth, Portsmouth, London. It's a very common thing. So you've had this day extending the bounds of empire. You're feeling very important, and you go home, and you're obviously absolutely shattered. You sit in your magnificently appointed mahogany parlour. Your butler comes in. In your left hand, he places a glass of port. You're English, so you drink port, not claret, like the French. And in your right hand, he places this book. This has just been published. It comes, you can buy a small one, but Goldney would have had a Quattro edition, which would have been massive, laced with gold, worth a lot of money. And of course, it's Thucydides. Now, Goldney was educated, so the first thing he's going to know about Thucydides is that he's really difficult in Greek. He probably learned Greek by reading this book. The second thing he's going to know is that Thucydides hates democracy. The most prominent translation before this one came out in 1753 was Thomas Hobbes. And the one thing Hobbes says about, the one thing Hobbes sort of is explicit about with Thucydides is that Thucydides argues for monarchy. Pericles is like a monarch. Pericles holds the sort of Athenian democracy in his hands, and democracy is a very anarchic system of government that breaks down the Athenian Empire and leads to its decline and fall. And this historiography can be found in this translation. Smith is very interesting because he devotes over 100 pages of introductory material to Thucydides. And the vast majority of it is looking at Thucydides' life. So we know he's a kind of, we know he was exiled, we know he was impartial, and looking at his qualities as an historian. There's 50-odd pages talking about how Thucydides tells the truth. Smith also summarizes the history in precisely these terms. He wants to publish this history to prove that democracy is a threat to the polity. But Smith also goes beyond Hobbes, because he doesn't just say democracy is a threat to a polity. He says, in particular, that democracy is a threat to a maritime empire, a maritime polity. And this point is made on the first page in the frontispiece. And I'm very sorry, but I couldn't get this in a higher resolution. But as soon as Goldney turned the first page, he'd have been confronted with this. Now, this image is very interesting. There's nothing else quite like this in Thucydidean scholarship. All of the 17th and 18th, all of the other 17th and 18th century editions depict the Peloponnesian War, depict people fighting, stabbing each other with spears. Not this one. This one depicts trade and commerce. On the left, we can see the globe, and it's a little bit it's a little bit low res, but there's astrolabes, there's maps, there's things like that, and a cherubim standing over it. This represents navigation, the achievement of navigation. In the middle, there's an altar. The altar carries the emblem of the Prince of Wales, to whom Smith dedicated the work. And Athena and Britannia flank this altar, again emphasising the links between Athens and modern Britain. There's the British lion to the right. And then on the far right, you can see another cherub, this time holding up the Fijian cap representing liberty. So we have all of the elements of a maritime empire, as well as a visual kind of coming together of Britain and Athens. And in the background, you can see one ship just coming past a rock, and then there's a couple more ships which are too faint to see, sort of disappearing over the horizon. They look nothing like triremes. And in the 18th century, people knew what triremes looked like. Potter's Antiquities of Greece has a very exact description of a fairly accurate-looking trireme, I must say. But Smith has chosen in his frontispiece to include specifically 18th century-looking ships. And Smith emphasises this point on the second page, which is a dedication to Prince George. And what he's saying is, he says, Athens was a great power. This letter's a couple of pages long, so I'll summarise it for you. Athens was a great power. She was run by a democracy. The democracy led to her decline and fall. And then he gets to this point. He says, well, actually, Britain was a great power. Britain, like Athens, has maritime power, but the maritime power of Great Britain is more substantially founded and has ever been more steadily supported than was that of Athens. Why is that so? Because Britain has a stable constitution. She does not have a democracy. Post the 1688 revolution, she has a balanced constitution, balanced between the people, as represented by Parliament, the oligarchs, as represented by the House of Lords, and the autocratic figure, as represented by Prince George's grandfather, King George II, 1753? George the some number. So Britain is complete, where Athens was deficient. Nevertheless, you can see that the Athenian history is much more relevant to British readers. And Smith is not alone in claiming this. The Baron de Montesquieu, probably the most important 18th century political philosopher to have written. I once had a drink with a Mon historian, and he told me all work after Montesquieu going down to sort of 1850 is merely a commentary on his works. And his greatest work was The Spirit of the Laws. And in The Spirit of the Laws, in a very often quoted passage, Montesquieu looks to pseudo-Xenophon's Constitution of the Athenians. We all know it as pseudo-Xenophon. Montesquieu actually believed it was by Xenophon. It was a genuine work. And Xenophon, of course, says Athens was deficient because she wasn't an island. Athens tried to make herself an island and sort of encapsulate herself in her long rules so she could defend against the Peloponnesians whilst dominating the Ionian Sea. But of course that hadn't worked. You know, they'd lost the Persian Wars. Sparta was able to kind of to tighten the grip and conquer Athens. But of course, Britain is an island. So, like Smith, Montesquieu's saying that Britain is complete, where Athens is deficient. Montesquieu's also saying something else very interesting. He's writing during the War of Austrian Succession, and one of the very common tropes during the War of Austrian Succession was to say that France was a militarized land-based power, like Rome. Rome, of course, conquered with the legions, gave everyone a damn good spanking. Britain, it was always said, was like Carthage, had lots of money, but no actual military ability. Carthage, of course, had lost to Rome, partly because all she could ever do was employ mercenaries. Well, not so, Montesquieu says. Montesquieu points not towards the parallel between commercial Britain and commercial Carthage, but to commercial Britain and commercial Athens. And what this discourse opens up is it allows Montesquieu to say, A, Britain is militarized, like Athens. You know, nobody could deny that Athens had won some quite astounding victories, not least in the Persian Wars, but also that Britain wasn't just a nation of traders. Britain was a cultural nation. Britain was starting to establish herself on the European stage as not just one of its powers, but perhaps its preeminent power. This is Montesquieu worrying about the future of France, trapped as she was on the continent. Was this a good thing? No, not for Montesquieu, it wasn't. The reason is, many people in the 18th century saw Britain and France as trapped in an intractable nexus. It's called jealousy of state or jealousy of trade, and it's best articulated by David Hume, although I've stuck with Montesquieu here. They thought that Britain and France were constantly competing, culturally, yes, commercially, and also militarily. And this was creating an industrial militarized state. The states were constantly arming. They were constantly arming other states, such as Germany and Spain, and trying to force them to be allies. And this was inevitably going to lead to the decline and fall of Europe and catastrophe, because eventually, they reasoned, Britain and France couldn't keep just competing peacefully. They were bound to use these massive standing armies, and disaster would ensue, and decline and fall of Europe relative to, say, India or China would ensue. And Montesquieu, quite fascinatingly, sees exactly the same thing happening in ancient Greece. He thinks that the rise of the Athenian Empire, yes, it led to a lot of culture. Yes, it led to some excellent military victories. But what it also led to was jealousy. Following the Thucydidean line that the Spartans were led into the Peloponnesian War because they were jealous and fearful of Athenian power, Montesquieu sees Athens as destabilizing, I think was the way you'd put it. Athens is like Britain. Athens is forcing the Greek world into this anarchic situation in which they're constantly competing with each other, between Athens and Sparta. And that's necessarily going to lead to things such as the Peloponnesian War. And that, like the decline and fall of Europe, or the potential decline and fall of Europe, is going to lead to the decline and fall of ancient Greece. And this is quite a common view. There was another French historian and also a philosopher called the Abbé de Mably. Now, Mably's largely forgotten today, but in his time he was he was more read than Rousseau, in fact, and the French Revolution was absolutely obsessed with him. And Mably read this passage of Montesquieu and thought, yeah, that's more or less right. And he wrote an entire history of Greece, saying that the Greek states were constantly sort of motivated by the jealousy that they were engendering in each other. And he saw a sequence of states that would rise up and then promote the ire of their neighbours until eventually Greece had so weakened itself she couldn't resist Philip of Macedon anymore. And he saw it as happening in this way. After the Persian Wars, the Greeks were more or less united. Then Athens starts to get more power, more culture, more military power. So Sparta has a go at them. Sparta maintains the hegemony of Greece until eventually Thebes does exactly the same. By this point, all of these Greek states are so weak, as I say, they've just got nothing to come back with against the Macedonians. So this is a very common discourse. And in Europe, therefore, it was fairly easy to equate Athens with Britain, but it was also an idea that was intimately connected to decline and fall. How did this translate into the American colonies? Because at the same time, of course, Britain was sending people out, both to the West Indies and North America. And people who went out there were obviously less concerned with what was going to happen on continental Europe. They were much more interested in what was going to happen to America and what was the internal dynamics of the empire. They didn't really worry about whether the empire was destabilizing French politics, and they weren't really worried about how French political thinkers were reacting to this. They were worried about the effect of trade and commerce and military expansion, and most of all, sort of imperial wars, on Britain and on Britain's imperial system. And a number of different sort of threads of thought can be elaborated here. The first one I want to point to is associated with this guy, Thomas Pownall. Now, Pownall's a very interesting figure. He was governor of Massachusetts in the 1750s and 60s. That is to say, he was governor of Massachusetts during the 7 Years' War, when England and France were basically fighting for the ownership of the entire North American continent. So Pownall is, first of all, annoyed by the French. He sees the British system as having to resist the French. He would become later in his life a great exponent of American colonial rights. When he went back to England, he became an MP and would often talk about Britain's need to accommodate with the American rebels during the Revolution. But as governor of Massachusetts, he was very, very concerned with popular uprisings, popular, discord, popular kind of revolts, which were much more common in the American colonies than they were back in Britain, largely, I suppose, because of the great stretch of the Atlantic which separated the two. And he writes numerous works which quote all sorts of Greek historians. There are dozens of references to Thucydides, dozens of references to Polybius, a couple to Plutarch, a couple to Xenophon. And what he sees in Greek history, what he sees in Athenian history, is a model for the British. He thinks Britain needs a much more tight empire. He doesn't see maritime empire as a kind of a loose coalition of free states. He sees maritime empire as a centralized imperial system. That the empire needs to coalesce on London, on Britain, on England and Scotland and Wales, and that the colonies themselves need to be subject allies, just as Chios and Delos and the various states which formed the Athenian Empire. And you get all sorts of references to this. The second one is the capitals are in the original, so it's I know nowadays when people text each other capitals, they think they're shouting. I'm not sure if that's true of the 18th century, but he's certainly emphasizing this stuff. He also points towards King Minos. In this passage of Thucydides, Thucydides talks about how Minos developed civilization in Greece because he had a centralized maritime empire. At least this is what Smith's translation said. It's perhaps a little more ambiguous in the Greek, but we know this is how it was often read in the 18th century. And this is what Pownall sees, and this is what Pownall quotes, and this is what Pownall tries to get across to his readership. So one of the things that happens when people go across to America is they feel the empire needs to be tighter, it needs to have more control. And this started a debate. Adam Smith is, of course, one of the greatest the greatest political economist who ever written, insofar as he started the entire subject. Adam Smith was going to publish The Wealth of Nations in 1776. He actually waited until 1777 because of the American colonies, because he wanted to insert an entire extra book. And that extra book was a history of colonialism. And in that history of colonialism, he said there were two types of colonial empire that ever existed. He said there was the Greek, and then there was the land, the territorial is his word, of Rome, of France, and of Spain. He particularly hates the Spanish. And the Greek, he defined in reference to the Corcyraean debate we find in Book 1 of Thucydides. And as I'm sure you all remember, the Corcyraean debate is about the rights of the colonies over Epidamnus in northern Greece. And one of the things Corcyra says is a Greek colony owes nothing to their mother state other than marks of esteem, marks of honour, and sort of religious deference. The colony does not have the right to tax. The colony does not have the right for exclusive trade, and the colony should sort of give over military help when required, but it's not meant to be too onerous. And Smith says this Greek form of colonization is the model that the British should follow. And he draws this distinction. Well, that's a voice in a debate that was really, really quite virulent in the colonies. This guy's called James Abercrombie. And Abercrombie was a Scottish guy who'd gone out to the Carolinas as a colonial agent. That is to say, he was in charge of sort of trading with the Indians, sorting out hunters. He was making money for companies back in London. And just as Pownall was struck by the volatility of politics in the colonies, so was Abercrombie. And pinging off the kind of ideas that Smith is putting around, Abercrombie looks to Greek history, and he says in particular that the Corcyraean arguments in their debate do not represent a valid form of empire. Like Pownall, he sees that if the British follow this, the empire will be too destabilised. It won't be able to look after its own subjects, and it won't be able to fight the French. So his conclusion is the first principle of colony government, whether amongst ancient or modern nations, has ever been to make the colonies subservient to the interests of the principal state. And this, as I say, is a very common pamphlet view of both the Athenian and the British empires coming out of America. But yet it's got a downside. This is William Young. William Young was deeply embedded in the imperial system. His father he'd fought in the 7 Years' War, and after the 7 Years' War was in charge of selling off French lands in the West Indies that had been captured. And his father wrote a very famous book in the 18th century extolling the virtues of British commerce and British civilization, and in particular British Empire vis-a-vis the French, who he thought were terrible and should never be allowed out of France. Young came along, and in 1777 he wrote a history of Athens. And it looks a lot like the kind of thing his father would say. He loves the Athenian Empire, he loves its commerce, he loves its democracy, he loves its freedom. And he says in particular, the Athenian Empire is the model for the British. All well and good. Except then Young got a bit older. He himself went out to the American colonies, and the American Revolution started. He published 2 more editions of this work, both of which were vastly revised each time. One in 1786, one in 1804. I've put up a quotation from each. Young went out when his father died and inherited these vast French slave colonies that his father had appropriated. And the slaves greeted him with, they really turned him. He turned up and he thought he was going to hate them. And they threw a party for him. They carried him on their shoulders around the island. They were just very, very nice to him. And he freed all his slaves. Couldn't believe the guilt that he'd owned these guys. And he went back and he met Wilberforce, and he became a very prominent abolitionist. And this seems to have started something in his mind, because he also started to worry about commerce. He was really worried that a commercial empire was actually under the process of decline and fall. He didn't believe commerce necessarily equated internal strength. He started to think commerce, riches and luxury might represent internal weakness. And there seems to be sort of 2 planks to this argument. The first is an ancient difference that is found in Sallust and is sort of re-articulated by Machiavelli. And that is the tension between a free society at home, the British believed their constitution was free as I represented, and tyrannising abroad. Aristotle in the Politics 780, I think, I don't have my notes in front of me, sorry, said that those who tyrannise abroad will no doubt tyrannise at home. Sallust in the Bellum Catiline, chapter 10, had said that the decline and fall of the Roman Republic was directly attributable to Romans going abroad, conquering people, massacring people, and then sort of bringing back all their wealth. And this wealth, as a sort of ill-gotten gain, was weakening their society. So Young seemed to be equating the decline and fall of Athens with its commerce, with its kind of with its militaristic kind of expansionist view. Therefore, we can say Young is his travels around the British Atlantic are giving him a view of the Athenian Empire directly opposed to those of Pownall and directly opposed to those of Abercrombie. It is the experience of the underside of commerce, of the slave trade and of the warfare, that is making Young start to think, well, actually, this isn't such a good thing. But also, he starts to... his view of commerce then becomes much, much more nuanced as we go on, and we can see this in the 1804 edition. And then he starts to realise commerce has 2 problems. First of all, he's reread his Sallust, and he realises there's a difference between private luxury and sort of public luxury. Public luxury would be building buildings, the Parthenon, etc. Private luxury is your ability to acquire money, slaves, and goods and chattels. And it's often said in ancient texts that public luxury is very good. It increases the kind of power of the state. Internal luxury is very bad because it makes people soft, makes them unwarlike. The other thing Young is starting to point towards, though, is 2 different types of commerce. There's commerce as the Romans did, and as he argues the Athenians did. That is to say, commerce of conquest. You just turn up, you fight someone, you take all their goods. There's no sort of work involved other than the brief point at which you're on military patrol. And that he associates very directly with the Sallustian idea of the decline and fall of Rome, and reads it into the decline and fall of Athens. But then there's another form of commerce. There's commerce as manufacture. And commerce as manufacture is a continual kind of production. It's not stealing. And this is quite a common view in the 18th century, to view commerce as manufacture within an imperial system as beneficial to mankind. And as you can see in the highlighted quote, Athens, despite earlier attempts to claim her as a commercial empire in Montesquieu, Young doesn't see it that way. This is not an empire that manufactures. This is an empire that merely takes over and destroys. So I think you can say, by the time you get to by the time the American Revolution is over, in 1783, the experience of maritime empire, the experience of commercial empire in the North Atlantic, has led to a bit of a mess in Athenian democracy in Britain. Many different views of the Athenian Empire and its decline and fall are starting to come out. And many of these are tied to the fate of the British Empire. And this is affecting historiography back in Britain. Jon Gillies never left Scotland, actually, as far as I can tell. He was historiographer royal in Edinburgh. But he seems to be this whole history is very much pinging off the kind of themes we've seen in Pownall and Young. And where the debate comes to focus is on the Periclean building programme. What did the Periclean building programme represent? Was it the appropriation of the wealth of the colonies, or was it Athenian commerce and Athenian ingenuity leaving a great sort of cultural beneficence for the world? And well, Gillies comes down on this opinion, as you can see. Pericles was blamed for decking Athens like a vain, voluptuous harlot at the expense of the plundered provinces. This, of course, is a Plutarch line, although I haven't highlighted the rest of the passage, but as you can see, he's read the funeral speech. And he's read the funeral speech as an encomium, as a celebration of private and private individual wealth. Of course, Pericles says at one point, we have wealth, we have culture, and it does not make us soft. It's a difficult passage to translate, but that's the gist of it. Gillies really doesn't seem to like this. He looks at the entertainments, he looks at the banquets, he looks at the sacrifices, and he looks at the increase of the private luxury. And this he sees as something dangerous to Athens. And this, I think, he also sees as something dangerous to Britain. There are other points of view. This is William Mitford. Now, Mitford gets a very bad press in modern historiography. He's seen as the paradigmatic, anti-democratic historian. And it's true to say, he was writing under the shadow of the French Revolution, and he hated democracy. He did not want the sort of terrible system he saw in France to be imported to Britain. But yet, conversely, he quite liked Pericles, and he quite liked commerce, and he quite liked the Periclean building programme. So we get this idea that in the age of Pericles, science and every polite art waited, as it were, only his magic touch to exhibit them to the world in meridian splendour. So unlike Gillies, for Mitford, all forms of Athenian commerce, be they, certainly all forms of Athenian luxury, be they private or public, were extremely beneficial to society. And this is the start of a very long passage in which he celebrates drama, he celebrates building, he celebrates art, and he celebrates science. And again, he draws parallels between Athenian achievements in culture and British achievements in culture. The British are going to equal Pericles. They're going to equal what the Athenians have achieved because they have a free, commercial, maritime, not exactly democratic, but certainly republican system, imperial system. And it's hard to say who's winning this debate, but I will say this. There's a lot of pamphlets knocking around during the American and French Revolutions, and a lot of them are comparing William Pitt the Elder and William Pitt the Younger to Pericles. And the text they're using to do that is Thucydides 265. They are saying the British are led in a way that is synonymous with the way Pericles led the Athenian Empire. And it's not a criticism. They're not saying, like Plutarch, Pericles led the Athenian Empire into decline because he imported all these luxuries, because he conquered all these nations. They're saying Pericles is leading Britain into this vision of glorious empire where we're going to defeat the French and we're going to establish ourselves on the world stage as the very epitome of maritime empire. And this is where historiography is by the end of the 18th century. It's in this debate between whether the Athenian Empire is good or bad, which you can then subdivide into various other debates. And I would argue a lot of these are rooted in the experience of the maritime empire. I've pointed towards Goldney, I've pointed towards Young, and I've pointed towards Pownall. Actually sailing around the Atlantic has led people to reflect very deeply on the nature of Athenian history and its relationship to Britain. I want to move into my third phase, though, and I want to ask, how did this relate to people who actually saw the Periclean building program in Athens? And the most important text, as you might expect, is Nicholas and Rivette, who travelled to Athens in the late 1750s. They published 5 volumes in all, although Stewart and Rivette, I would say Nicholas and Rivette. John Athenian Stewart and Nicholas Rivette. Stewart was dead by 1790, so he only actually published the first 2 volumes, and Rivette was dead by 1804, so he only published the first 3, although people carried on publishing them for them. Stewart was a scholar, an antiquary, and archaeologist, and he received funding from the Society of the Dilettanti to go out to Athens with a very definite aim in mind. That is, they wanted to revitalise British architecture through an appropriation of Athenian culture. And what the Society of the Dilettanti expected him to do was go out and draw and plan the Periclean building programme, particularly the Parthenon. And accordingly, much of the 5 volumes are devoted over to very meticulous plans. Hogarth, there's a very, I don't have it actually, and I wish I'd put it in now. Hogarth has, in the volumes, they have the 5 orders of architecture as exemplified by various buildings. And Hogarth, who was a great satirist, has the 5 orders of periwigs as exemplified by 5 different wigs. So people were very aware of this importation of Athenian culture, and they also thought it was a bit funny and a bit ridiculous. And these 5 volumes were published, but in fact people weren't very happy with them, because when Nicholas and Rivette got here, it took them a bloody long time to get this stuff off the ground. There's a guy called Leroy who comes 18 months after they've left. He leaves, again, very quick. He manages to get all his drawings done in 3 months, and he still publishes his view of Athens before Nicholas and Rivette get theirs out. So, they were very, very slow. The other thing they did wrong, which annoyed everybody at the time, was they published things in the wrong order. They didn't publish the Parthenon in the first volume. In fact, they waited, almost 18 years to publish the Parthenon. Because they were so focused on architecture as a practical science, they went straight in and sort of found Roman buildings which had better preserved columns, which could be used by contemporary architects. So there was real problems with what these guys were doing. However, they definitely opened up Athens as a kind of visual world for British readers. Nothing like this had been created before. And actually, they kind of got the ball rolling. Quite soon after this, William Hamilton, who was ambassador to Naples, married to Lady Hamilton, who was Nelson's lover, he would publish his an engraved collection of his Greek vases. Those kind of things proliferate in the final quarter of the 18th century, largely prompted, I would argue, by this Greek revival of Stewart and Rivette. I've put up 2, not plans, but pictures that they included, etchings, just to show sort of their skills. These are much better than the French ones, I must say. Here we have the Parthenon. Now, they're bringing all this culture back to Athens, but I've already told you it's a historiographical problem, and it's a political problem for these readers, whether Athenian commerce and Athenian culture represents a pinnacle of civilization or a symptom and cause of the decline and fall of Athens and maritime empire. And, well, they can't get away from this issue. So this is Richard Chandler. Richard Chandler was a Oxford scholar, sorry. He taught classics at Oxford, and like Stewart and Rivette, he went to the Society of the Dilettanti and said, send me out to Greece so I can write a travel log. His very good friend had just written a travel log explaining the classical ruins of Palmyra. So the Society of Dilettanti thought that's a good idea. He's a well-known scholar. And they sent him out. And in fact, they sent him out with Rivette. Stewart and Rivette had fallen out and would never talk to each other again, but Rivette needed to go back to Greece to finish the engravings. So Chandler went back with him. And it's quite clear from the preface to Chandler's work that he's inspired to go to Athens, not so much by reading dramatic texts or even Thucydides, but because he's seen the buildings and he thinks they need a fuller 18th century description. And it's also quite clear that he sees these buildings as intimately connected to Pericles. It was the fortune of Athens, whilst flourishing in glory, dominion and revenue, to produce Pericles. That's all he says. I didn't find much else about Pericles in the entire work. And it's quite clear he's coming down on the Mitford line rather than the Gillies line. You're in Athens. You're looking at the ruins. Now, often when people look at ruins, you remember Edward Gibbon. Edward Gibbon's inspired to think about the decline and fall of Rome while sitting in the Parthenon. He sees, and one of the things Gibbon is connecting is the magnificence of the state to its subsequent decline and fall through these discourses of commerce. Not so much for Chandler. Chandler sees these kind of beautiful, these exquisite ruins, and he sees them as a pinnacle of civilization. He doesn't connect them to decline and fall. When he says flourishing in glory, dominion and revenue, he's clearly coming down on the Mitford line of the Athenian Empire. The Athenian Empire is a good thing. It's commercial, it's strong, and it's maritime. And Chandler seems to emphasise this head on in the next sentence I've made bold, I've emphasised. Because here you can see he's linking the building of the Periclean building programme to manufacture, to trade. It's not being linked so much to the importation of slaves, the importation of conquered money, the importation of conquered goods, but actually Pericles brings in tradesmen, he's bringing in wealth, and he's producing, he's manufacturing. That is to say, there's a kind of almost Adam Smith style economic interpretation of the rise of the Athenian Empire. And he, to sort of emphasise this point, he closes with the Periclean anecdote of with the Plutarchian anecdote of Pericles offering to pay out of his own money for the buildings of Athens. The question is, how does this affect our notions of decline and fall? Well, it's difficult. Decline and fall, when people think about the Athenian Empire historically, is linked to both internally to corruption and externally to the movements of the Greek states until they're so weak they can't resist the Macedonians. Yet, when you're faced with the ruins of Athens, you start to realise something else. This is the introduction to Stewart and Rivette's second volume, which is dealing with the Parthenon. And, of course, in a throwaway line, they say the Athenians were a free people during the administration of that great statesman Pericles. That's a fairly standard line now. But they also say something quite interesting. When Athens was subject to the Romans, even though they were deprived of their liberty and greatly fallen from their ancient splendour, it was still a respectable city. That is to say, Nicholas and Rivette are aware that many of the ruins of Athens were built under the Romans. They were built when Athens had no more liberty, when the liberty had been extinguished by Philip of Macedon and Hadrian and whoever you want to point to. So decline and fall is no longer associated with the Spartans, no longer associated with the Greek state system. Rather, it's associated much more specifically with the history of Greece as a nation. Athens just becomes the sort of cultural epitome of the Greek state, of Greece as a kind of geographical area. But it's no longer about the decline and fall of Athens. That might sound a little mixed up. It doesn't seem to make much sense, and it doesn't make much sense to me. Because it's not a very good idea of decline and fall. But it seems to be that Rivette and Stewart are moving in this direction of seeing Athens not as an individual polis, but as sort of part of a Greek culture. And as particularly as part of the Roman Empire. And for me, this is emphasised both in this quote by William Wilkins and also in a sort of lengthy 30-page excursus in Chandler. Both of these guys start to think very, very carefully about what happened to the Athenian ruins and what happened to Athenian culture. Neither of them link it to Sparta. Neither of them link it to the Greek state system. In fact, you end up with 30-page descriptions of the fate of Greece under the Roman Empire. And in fact, the baddies don't now become are not now the empire, are not now wars of Greece. They are Alaric, they are the Venetians, and they are the Turks. And this is emphasized over and over again. I've just picked out one translation, but sort of many of the descriptions of individual buildings as well as descriptions of whole cities are prefaced with this idea that Athens was in fact ruined under the Roman Empire. They're still looking towards liberty, they're still looking towards the empire as the high point, but they're not worried about the decline of the empire or the decline of democratic Athens per se, but their decline under the Roman Empire and under subsequent modern history. I just want to conclude quite quickly, because we are in George Finley's house, with a quote by George Finley. So George Finley wrote a history of Greece from the Roman conquest to the present time. Not about ancient Greece. Well, it is, because Finley seemed to believe that the ancient Greeks were the very pinnacle of Greek civilization, and that their liberty and their culture had been kind of subsumed into the Macedonian, the Roman, the Turkish empires. And so like Nicholas and Rivette, he sees the decline and fall of Greece in this very long durée period. But yet he also believes, and I think maybe this is something that was there in the 18th century but was never articulated, that 2,000 years of suffering have not obliterated their national character, that is to say the Greeks, not extinguished the national ambition. That is to say, there's a sort of inverted bell curve now in thought about the history of Greece. People think you have the classical pinnacle under Pericles. It declines, it falls. You're stuck in the Byzantine medieval period, which nobody likes. But yet maybe, just maybe, that sort of Periclean character is still in the Greeks. And maybe people like Finley, by writing these books, can kind of draw it out. And that Greece will be great once again. I've talked long enough, but I'd just quickly like to conclude. What is the point of this research? The question every PhD student dreads to be asked by both examiner and conference presentation audience. Well, I'm going to preempt you and answer it myself. What is the point for classicists and ancient historians? Well, I think there's 2 points. First of all, it provides an intellectual genealogy of our subject. I recently read a book on Roman Britain. It had an entire chapter outlining the idea of decline and fall from Gibbon to Havelock. Maybe I'm being a little unfair, but I've never read any Greek history that is kind of consciously looking back to previous scholarship, certainly not before Grote. Now, I would argue there's actually a hell of a lot of ancient historical scholarship before Grote. Depends quite how you count them, but in French and English, you can say there's 18 histories of Rome written in the 18th century. There's 16 written of Greece. Greece is a very important subject at this time, and I think it's about time we got to grips with what this meant and what our sort of intellectual tradition is. I also think sometimes this kind of research might suggest forgotten avenues, forgotten questions, or also, all historical research is kind of contemporized of its time. Well, it might be quite interesting to interrogate Hume, to interrogate these old readings, to interrogate Young, because they lived in a different time. Maybe, of course, they don't have our knowledge of archaeology, our knowledge of epigraphy, but perhaps their different ways of viewing the world might offer us something. And I point there to the hierarchy. They're obsessed with the role of sailors in the democracy, and in fact that's something I think modern scholarship, as a question modern scholarship might want to look to. What's the point for modern historians? Well, I think there's a problem in modern history in terms of defining empire. For the last 15 years we've been very much aware of absolutist empires, of the histories of Rome and France and Spain, but there's very little about the kind of consciously free and commercial maritime empire. And I think once we look at the political and historiographical role of Athens, we can start to flesh out one of these very important and peculiar visions and definitions of empire in the early modern period. Finally, and very quickly, where am I going to go with this? Well, I've already started, and I'd like to thank Amalia and the library ladies, looking at this stuff in the 19th century, looking at Finley's view. So I'm really hoping to push ideas of decline and fall on into the 19th century, and to also compare and contrast this view of the decline and fall of Greece with the decline and fall of the Athenian Empire. That is to say, I want to place Finley's view of decline and fall next to Grote's vision of the Athenian Empire. I want to see how these two discourses increasingly separate over the course of the early 19th century. And yeah, that's what I'm probably going to do. And yeah, thank you for listening.